Gabor, I am so honored to be talking to you. Thank you so much for making time on such short notice. And I'm so thrilled that it fits in with your new book coming out. But maybe first we could talk a little bit about your book, Hold On to Your Kids,
Mm-hmm.
because I just so resonate with that message. And I'd love to know what were the sort of experiences in Canada that led you to see this so clearly, that the peer group is toxic and how important it is to have that more intergenerational contact.
Well, what is toxic for human beings is the loss of what a wonderful psychologist in the US calls our evolutionary niche. So, how we evolved was not the way we live today. Over eons, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, really, the species developed living in small groups with multiple generations living together, with the children always being around the adults, with infants being held by the adults all the time, and children having multiple playmates of different ages with free play out there in nature. Now, that's how we evolved. Now, human beings are infinitely, or almost infinitely adaptable. They can live in a range of environments, but that doesn't mean they do well in all environments, especially on our when our emotional needs that evolution ingrained us with are not met. We suffer. Now, one of those needs is for attachment, for healthy, connected relationships with nurturing adults. In the modern world, that for all kinds of cultural reasons, economic and political reasons, has been eroded. So children very often grow up under the influence mostly of their immature peers, which is contrary to their needs and completely undermines their development. Now, I can't take credit for that book. The main author is a friend of mine, Gordon Neufeld, a wonderful psychologist here in Canada. I did the writing with him, but what he teaches is completely congruent with what I've understood about the way that this culture undermines healthy human development.
But this was so amazing for me just in a few years to see how in the traditional culture in Ladakh, I could see that when the 1-year-old was helped by the 5-year-old brother,
Yes.
that there was never a sense of, oh, I'm not good enough. There was a constant collaborative teaching and learning going on the entire time, throughout your whole lifetime. And then also to witness that the young men were involved in looking after younger siblings, young
Yes.
animals. And
Yes.
what that does to your masculinity is that it allows you to keep some of that feminine, nurturing energy. And then I saw with the advent of the consumer culture, suddenly, literally, Barbie and Rambo coming in as role models. And as you said, in that peer culture, the toxic peer culture, I always talk about that as being very similar to the factory farm chickens. You put
Mm.
31-year-olds in a room and you have created nothing but elbows, screams, and competition. So we
Bullying.
create
Yeah.
structures, yeah, structures of
Yeah.
anger and competition.
Yeah.
So do you feel now that people are waking up to this more? Do you feel that there is a shift going on so that,
Well, what I, what,
yeah,
what I what I see is that a culture, and we're talking about a globalized culture,
okay,
because economics and therefore culture has been globalized, and more and more it's becoming homogenized throughout the world. So that's created a real crisis in physical health and in mental health and in many areas of human existence. As a result of the crisis that the system is generating, it is also invoking a reaction and a desperation on the part of people for a different point of view, a different understanding, and a different approach. So the system, as Karl Marx said, in the 19th century, any system creates its own contradictions. So that as the crisis deepens, so does people desperation and hunger for a different point of view magnify, and that's what I see happening right now.
yeah. And I also see that I think you also wrote that somewhere, but I see that people's bodies, people's souls, their deeper needs ultimately are coming through, and it's that need for connection. It's the need for connection to others and to life, to the land, to the animals, to the plants. And this is, of course, what our movement is about, what I'm calling
Mm.
localization, is the
Yeah.
systemic turning away from the globalizing consumer culture to rebuild connected human scale economies so that we start experiencing that interdependence between generations.
You
And
know, I
yeah,
travel quite a bit internationally, but particularly in North America. I think that at some time, at some sane time, whenever that'll arise, people are not going to believe how we lived. When I go from town to town and I see the same malls and the same corporate logos and the same franchise, cold-hearted, soulless businesses and the same uh, non-aesthetic architecture and the absolute lack of originality. And they compare it to local shops and pastry stores and artisans and hardware stores. This is going to seem totally insane. And just the sheer boring homogeneity of it from town to town and from major urban center to small cities, it's all the same thing. People don't look back, and the sheer bleak architectural bleakness of it. People aren't going to believe how we lived.
no, and I think you're being very kind when you say non-aesthetic and bleak, because really, let's call it what it is. It is ugly. It
Yeah,
is ugly and it is deadly,
yeah,
because what it is monoculture, is anti-life, and life is diversity. Every single cell in our bodies, every single individual, every single leaf, that uniqueness is what we evolved with. We evolved through experiential knowledge relating to and shaping our identity based on those connections. And part of that too was that every child knew that nobody was perfect. Perfection is part of the enemy, the deadliness of those monocultures.
one of the evolutionary needs built into the human brain is actually free play, free creative play. We have a system in our brains for play. Animals do. If you look at any mammal species, they play. And that play is an important part of their development. It's not just sort of fun and games, it's there for a developmental reason. So, what happens in a culture when you deprive kids of free play? And, I think I'm pretty good because some of my videos have been seen by even a couple of million people online.
Yeah,
But there's a 9-year-old kid I found out recently who tests plastic homogenized toys, and he's one of these influencers.
yeah,
He gets a lot of money for testing out toys. He's 9 years old. One of his toy little demonstrations with an utterly synthetic, unimaginative piece of garbage plastic has had 2 billion views.
yeah,
Now talk about globalization of robbing children of their childhoods by selling them these prefab products that utterly drains them of imagination. And this is what's going on in the world. Now, if you ask me in my book, do I condemn it? I'm not writing a book of condemnation. I mean, I'm not interested in condemning things. I'm interested in describing them and showing their impact. And so I'm writing this book in which I show the impact on human health of this neoliberal globalized culture. And
well,
it's not a pretty picture.
no, and it's so badly needed, Gabor, and may it reach the entire globe, because that toxic plastic consumer culture is reaching every corner. And I've been in the yurts of Mongolia and in huts with the Maasai, and I'm seeing this sale of this plastic, competitive, toxic consumer culture, which
Mhm.
at the same time as it's imposing this completely unnatural identity is destroying the planet, driving up emissions and and the
Well,
mining. Yeah.
you know the Yeah, so the title of the book, which will be published next April, is The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And the toxicity of the culture lies in its absolute denial of human needs. Now, you're quite right that the culture not only imposes some hurts on everybody, it also creates a new kind of human character. The the great social psychologist Eric Fromm talked about what he called the social character. And the social character is what every society creates about how individuals are made to absorb the expectations of the culture. Now, if you live in a culture which is connected and community minded and collaborative and respectful, you're going to develop a certain social character. Uh, but if you live in a culture that whose fundamental belief is, or at least the propaganda is, that human beings are individualistic, antagonistic, aggressive, and selfish, competitive, then you're going to create people in that image, which is an utter denial of their essential human nature, of how we evolved. And so we're actually creating ourselves in ways that go contrary to our nature. And therein lies the toxicity of the culture. Even apart from the pollution, even apart from the destruction of the condition for a healthy climate, even apart from all the poisonous products that are mass marketed and globally sold, just the way that we're made to be as human beings goes contrary to our nature. That itself is enough to make us sick.
Absolutely. And then, this narrative of us being aggressive, greedy, competitive by nature, that's been pushed on us, and I've seen it pushed more aggressively in the last 30 years. I
Yeah.
helped to set up a group called the International Forum on Globalization. And so
Mm.
we were a group of 40 people from around the world studying the impact of the trade treaties that
Mm.
have been the contracts that have given corporations the right to dominate and control our governments. And
Yeah.
that has meant to dominate science, to dominate education, to
Yeah.
dominate every avenue of knowledge. It's been colonized. And yet, what gives me so much hope is, what you're saying is exactly what it is. It's so clear when you see, as I did in traditional culture, that we are made to live in a more collaborative way. Every child that's born longs for, needs that love and connection, needs to be held and carried by those numerous people who have the time, who have the patience, because they're not stressed, because they're not being pushed by an economic system into counting every second of the day. So yeah, I think we might see, you and I, before we die, we're roughly the same age, we might see a wake up where we'll start also identifying that neoliberal economic system as the driver and start looking at the mechanisms where we can actually put a stop to it. But in the meanwhile, we're both trying to raise awareness about that, and we're encouraging people to connect locally. And I know that you would see the multiple reasons why that's so important.
Well, one of the neoliberal epidemics is isolation, loneliness.
Exactly.
So if you look at the statistics and the number of people that are lonely, they've gone way up in the last 30, 40 years. Now, that is not simply an emotional loss, it's actually something that threatens human health. So people who are lonely, they're more likely to fall sick to any manner of disease. And if they fall sick, they're more likely to die of it more quickly because physiologically, we need each other. Physiologically, I'm not even just talking about emotionally, I'm talking about
Yeah.
sheer from the point of maintaining our immune systems and the integrity of our cardiovascular system and so on. We need connection. When you have a system that actively undermines the social network and destroys communities because it throws people out of jobs without any thought to the impact of what that will have on a local community. When a Walmart can come in and completely obliterate small local businesses, that has huge impact on people's connection to each other and therefore on their health. And so you can't separate the individual from the environment. And this society functions as if we were all separate individuals. In fact, it's based on that ideology. Well, that'd be okay if it worked, but it doesn't. It actually undermines health. And so you have an increase in all manner of, I'm talking as a physician, what we're seeing is an epidemic of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic illnesses, real epidemic of mental health conditions amongst the youth, increased youth suicide, depression, anxiety. Children are being diagnosed with all manner of this or that disorder, all of which actually reflect the consequences of a system that denies children's developmental needs and fails to provide children or adults with a healthy, connected environment. And that has to do with the exigencies of neoliberal economics.
Yeah, we need to be able to say clearly too, how is it that our government leaders are so alert to trying to do something about COVID when we know that we've had these epidemics that are leading to, as you said, obesity, heart disease, epidemics of cancer as well. Why is nothing being done about that? Well, we can see that dealing with obesity, for instance, would reduce corporate profit. Right now, the way things are set up, dealing with COVID increases corporate profit. So we are being shaped, we are being pulled in a direction that allows the for-profit motive of fewer and fewer people. That's the crazy thing too. There are fewer and fewer winners in this system. Some global billionaires, we're talking about less than 1% of humanity, and yet we are blindly going along with essentially a system which taxes, subsidizes, and regulates to support this concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations is really the issue more than individuals. And yeah, we are going to be, we're facing, for me, the worrying thing is that the breakdown this causes, the mental and physical breakdown, makes it, of course, harder and harder for people to resist. But at the same time, Gabor, from China to, Africa to literally every continent, we are working with grassroots groups that are restoring the connections and starting with food, which we see as the most important industry. And also, I've been saying for years that the two most important functions we perform as human beings, how we grow our food and how we grow our children, those two areas have been relegated to shadows and to insignificance. And in this localization movement, we're raising them to the center.
So food is an interesting one to consider because you mentioned the corporations. There's a endocrinologist, a specialist in human metabolism and hormonal issues called Robert Lustig, who wrote a book called The Hacking of the American Mind. And what he means by that is that the corporations have actually sold and promulgated the use of foods that are actually addictive. They're literally addictive. Now that's been documented by other people as well. So that the food corporations deliberately figure out which combination of salt, sugar, and fat will actually have the most addictive impact on the human brain, so as to create a false demand, which feeds obesity. And Lustig told me that as an endocrinologist, he used to love his job, but now he doesn't anymore because he's seeing more and more children showing up with metabolic diseases that only adults used to have because of the corporate driven destruction of local food production and the sales of mass consumption artificial foods. And the impact worldwide is they call it coca-colonization,
Exactly.
the impact of sugar. And in the third world, the so-called developing world, which is a nice euphemism for
Yeah.
the oppressed and the exploited world. But in the developing world, they have troops of poor women going door to door, selling Nestle's products, which displace for a mother's milk,
Yeah.
to the effect of causing illness and obesity in children now. But and just to finish this thought, so there's a Vancouver-based lawyer and author called Joel Bakan, who's written a book called The Corporation,
I know him. Yes.
and then a
Yeah.
sequel called The New Corporation, and where he says, in American law, the corporation is considered to be a person. He says, well, how would you diagnose the person who sells toxic products, kills millions of people, and has no conscience about it, and continues to do it? You call him a sociopath.
Yeah. Exactly.
And
But
these
I
are the
think,
people that these
yeah.
are the people that run the world.
Yeah. But again, I think it's really helpful to see that it's the machine-like structure of the corporation that's running the world. Because actually, if you remember in their film, The Corporation, they have a woman sitting there proudly, seemingly proudly, or certainly unashamedly, talking about marketing to children of, again, plastic rubbish. It's the specialization. I've sat on the stage at the European Economic Forum, with a woman from Unilever, proudly boasting about how they're going to be increasing biodiversity from 10 major products. And when I try to say, well, in our localization movement, we are working with countless products. We haven't even begun to identify them yet because we're so ignorant of the biodiversity of the world system. So I see the big problem dealing with an over specialization linked to large scale. We're wired for connection, for care and love, and we're being pushed in the direction of competition and fear at an escalating rate.
Well, there was a great scientist called Jaak Panksepp. I think he was Estonian. He lived and worked in the United States. And there was
Can you say his name again?
Jaak, Jaak,
Yeah.
Panksepp, Panksepp.
Oh, I never heard of him.
And wow, he was one of these wonderful neuroscientists and brain researchers. And he distinguished a number of brain systems that are built into all mammals, actually. I mentioned one of them. Play was one of them.
Yeah.
Care is another. Panic and grief, which has to do with the loss of relationship, is another. Fear is another. Lust is another. Rage is another, because we have to generate healthy anger to protect our boundaries. There was no circuitry for competition.
Yeah.
There's no brain system that supports competition.
Wow.
There's no brain system that's all about aggression. There's the rage system, but that rage system is designed to generate a healthy, fierce anger to protect one's boundaries, but all these assumptions that this society ascribes to human nature, they don't exist in our neurophysiology. Care
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
Care exists in our physiology.
Yeah. And now the scary thing is the propaganda that robots will do a better job and that robots will be there to care for the elderly. That this, I don't know if you've seen it, but I'm seeing it all the time now. It's subtle, but it's all pervasive. The idea that human beings, greedy, aggressive, stupid, haven't done anything about climate change, they don't care, and they're destroying the world. So let's welcome in the robots because they're going to be wiser and kinder than humans. It's very scary. Well, are you in Canada now? Do you feel your book will be reviewed? You will get it out,
Oh
this
yeah,
new book?
it's going to be published internationally. It'll be published in Canada, the States, the U.S., UK, China. I don't
Really?
remember, Korea, I think so far, Hungary, Australia, I'm sure, but a British publisher will bring it to us. Yeah, it'll
That
be
is
published internationally.
fabulous, Gabor. It's going to be such a gift to the world. The international nature of the problem is one of the the biggest problems. That it feels too far removed, it feels too hidden. Everybody's being trained to look at their individual actions. They care about people, if they care about the environment, it's what they do as an individual. And then they're looking at this theater of left-right politics, which, as you know, has become completely meaningless. And the sort of potential of doing things at the community level, which is what we're doing in the localization movement, where we're starting particularly around food, linking up farmers and consumers. We're actually creating real viable lifeboats that, by the way, also lead to deep intergenerational connection that are remarkably healing. Have you seen that also in your work with addiction and mental illness? Have you seen, there are some beautiful examples. For instance, Johan Hari wrote about one in his book Lost Connections, where the people starting to actually grow a garden, who were depressed and addicted. And they say, as the garden flourished, so did they. There is that deep healing that comes through the community connection and the connection with the land, and doing something that's meaningful and genuinely productive.
Well, what I saw, and I write about it in my book on addiction, is I worked in what is North America's most concentrated, dire area of drug use by far, the downtown east side of Vancouver, for which is all kinds of historical reasons. But there are more
really? In North America, it's one of the worst. I'm so surprised.
No, one of the worst. It's the most concentrated area of drug use anywhere.
In North America or in Canada?
In North America, but I would say almost anywhere in the world.
Oh my God, I didn't realize
certainly
that.
anywhere in the industrialized world.
Really?
And within a few square block radius, there are just thousands of people injecting and inhaling and ingesting substances of all kinds. Highly traumatized people, all of them abused and neglected in childhood. And of course, they have to hustle for their drugs because the drugs are, due to the wisdom of our governments, are illegal. So that they have to hustle for them and commit crimes to get them and so on. While meanwhile, the tobacco companies get to kill millions of people every year without having to pay any price for it whatsoever. That's a whole other story. But the point I wanted to make is that even in that community of hustle and fear and illness and mental health conditions and desperation, there are such acts of communal kindness and people coming together and wanting to support each other, even as they rip each other off. They still care for each other. And it seems like a contradiction, but it isn't really, because their addiction makes them behave in a certain way, but their humanity and their need forces them to actually care for one another as well. So I saw beautiful examples of that there.
That is so wonderful to hear. And of course, in a very different way, and I'm not doing this to romanticize poverty, but I used to reflect on, every year I'd be in Delhi, and then every year in New York and San Francisco and Paris and London and so on. And I used to reflect on, why did I get so much more upset by the homeless on the streets of New York than I did on the streets of Delhi? And I realized that in Delhi, they were in communities. They were even in families. They were intergenerational groups together. And whereas on the streets of New York, were these isolated individuals, without anyone to care.
In one of his books, Sir Michael Marmot, who studies inequality in health and so on, he's Australian, I think, originally, and moved to the England and into the States, I think. But he talked about how a person in poverty in the States is infinitely richer than a person in India, but actually much less happy, and indeed even has a shorter lifespan. So it's not just about absolute monetary parameters, but also about community and one's sense of value. One is in this society, if you don't own much, you're made to believe that you're worthless, that your economic worth equals your human worth. Well, that itself is a soul-destroying and health and illness-producing belief. But
Yeah, and
that's what people are made to believe in this particular system.
And in this system too, the valuing of just the left brain and the more PhDs you have and the
Yeah.
higher status you have because of your many years of study, again, divisive and ill-conceived, because we're training up, this left brain, simplistic thinking,
Well,
and
let
the
me tell you
more,
let me tell you about a study that I ran across writing my new book. This is gonna You're sitting down, I trust, because otherwise you would fall off in amazement if I told you this.
yeah,
Uh, this research study, I don't know how many
yeah,
PhDs it took to figure this one out, but
yeah,
they did some research, and you know what they learned?
what,
Are you ready for this?
yeah.
They learned that grandmothers are good for grandkids.
You
And this,
know,
and you know what else they found out? This is even more astonishing. That the closer the grandmother lives, lives to the child, the better.
oh,
Now,
but
now how many
yeah,
PhDs
yeah,
did it take to figure that one out?
yeah. Well, I tell you, I am so thrilled. There are some PhDs figuring that out because literally just yesterday I was talking to a bunch of young mothers and talking about the importance of grandmothers.
Yeah,
And I even in my own little informal study, I've seen that those people who've had grandparents nearby
yeah,
tend to have more secure identities.
absolutely.
And yeah,
It turns out, you see, that the heart itself has an intelligence. It has a brain.
yes,
It had nerve cells which are
yes,
connected to the brain up here.
yeah,
And what's happened in the West is that that connection has been largely silenced.
yeah.
Um, so that now we need to convince our intellects what the heart already knows. And whose heart doesn't know that a loving grandmother is a terrific support to life, you know.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
here is we have to prove it to ourselves through intellectual study. That's part of the insanity of our culture, is that we have to keep proof to ourselves the obvious.
yeah, yeah. And much worse than that, that we're holding beliefs that damage us so deeply. But above all, I would say it's the ignorance of the economy. I'm finding, I don't know if you see a bit of a gender difference here, but I do find that women generally are a bit more connected to the heart and, if you like, the right
They,
side
they
of the
are,
brain.
they are, they are, but there's a problem there.
Yeah, tell me.
If you look at who has the preponderance of autoimmune diseases
Yeah.
and non-smoking related cancers, it's women.
Huh.
And there's a reason for that. Or for example, if you, and I talk about this in my new book, if you look at something like multiple sclerosis, that in the 1930s used to be about gender equal, you know what the ratio now is? Three and a
No,
half women to every man, for one man.
really?
Yeah, no, there's reasons for that. Because in this heart connectedness of women, they're also acculturated to suppress their own needs, to look after the needs of everybody else.
Yeah,
And that actually suppresses the immune system.
yeah.
So that while it's true what you say, at the same time, in a sense, that works against women because
Wow.
because they're acculturated to use all that hard energy for the benefit of others while ignoring themselves.
Yeah,
And these are precisely the people that develop autoimmune disease for reasons I can't tell you now. It's fully laid out in one of my books, and I say more about it in the new one. But there is this gender ratio of chronic illness very much against women because of the stress that compulsive caregiving imposes on women.
yeah,
And that,
yeah.
by the way, showed up during COVID. There's all kinds of studies about the impact on mothers of COVID and how the caregiving wasn't shared equally between the genders.
Really.
Yeah.
Well, I think the what I was going to say is that, which is sort of in a way relates to what you're saying, which is that I see the women having more of that heart connection, and I totally agree. They tend to be neglecting their own needs, and I didn't realize that it was so dramatically at the expense of their own health.
Yeah.
But what's also problematic for me is that they tend to shy away from looking at what is essentially a patriarchal system, this techno-economic hegemony that is global, very distant,
Yeah.
and they tend to say, Helena, shut up, don't keep talking about this. I don't want to hear about it. Tell me about how to grow beetroot or something, or how to better care for my children. But I'm trying to enlist more women into just stepping back to look at this madness of this economic system. As we were saying, how we measure growth, it is so upside down. It's a toxic anti-life system that is destroying us, and you're spelling that out so clearly. So I think that the slightly worrying thing that I see in the alternative movements, including a college where I used to teach, Schumacher College, is there's now an overemphasis on the heart, only listening to the heart. And I always go back to quoting my Tibetans, who have a beautiful way of talking about the need for both compassion and wisdom.
Yeah.
And they argue that, compassion without wisdom is dangerous, and wisdom without compassion is equally dangerous.
But just a minute, there is no wisdom without compassion.
Well, very good point. Very good point.
There might be
Yeah, very good point.
there might be intellectual brilliance,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
there won't be any wisdom.
No, excellent. Yeah, let's put it this way then. The brain without the heart.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why the whole idea of intellectual learning and the way kids are educated, which is largely non-experiential and it's all thought-based, doesn't really promote genuine learning. Because genuine learning, as it would have been in hunter-gatherer days, purely experiential. Now, we've come a long way. It's not a question of getting rid of intellectual knowledge, but divorcing it from experiential knowledge is to render it lame.
And I would say dangerous also.
Yeah.
And also, I'm sure you agree with the need for using, your hands and your body. And again, seeing that in the traditional cultures, these young children, I mean, boys age 5, running up the mountain, using their bodies and learning practical skills, and incredible also, such refined vision. They could see on a mountain, a few kilometers away, they could recognize their own animals, and the sort of speed and intelligence was remarkable. Then you now put them into a cement box without windows.
Literally, we're working with impoverished brains, and because it's the social environment and the physical environment that actually programs the brain. It's not just our genes. Two thoughts come into mind. One is, have you read the Continuum Concept by Jean Leadhoff?
Yes, she was a friend of mine. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, so I don't have to tell you, but just
yeah.
But what was I going to say about? Oh yeah, have you seen a movie called a documentary? It came out maybe 10, 15 years ago called Babies.
No.
Okay, so they took, I think it was called Babies, and they followed 4 newborns from San Francisco, maybe somewhere in Europe, some in Mongolia, and in Africa. And they followed them for the first year of life. And of course, the African kid is just held, carried everywhere by the mother, breastfed the whole year, is never alone, always in the company of adults. When the adults are singing, he's sitting there, At the end of the year, you see these 4 kids. And the African kid, I don't have to stand up to do this, and I can show it to you on the screen, but he's like just grounded and powerful. He's like a 1-year-old little warrior. And by warrior, I don't mean that he's aggressive or murderous. I just mean that he's just ready to take it on,
Yeah.
And just so powerful in himself, so self-confident as compared to the other 3 kids.
Yeah.
He's like a different creature.
Wow. Well, this is again what I lived through in Ladakh. The children, they literally didn't cry. I mean, when I say literally, I mean it was so rare that it was almost non-existent.
Yeah.
And then, like you say, carried and held the whole time. And the more mothers, the better. And the more that the boys and the uncles and grandfathers can be mothers, the better they are and the happier they are.
Well, but here's what happens. I mentioned that care system in the brain.
Yeah.
But these instinctual systems need to be evoked by the environment.
Yes.
And when they're not, they
Ye-
just kind of attenuate and they shut down.
Yes.
So when a boy is taking care of a little one, his care system is actually building.
Yes.
And so that neurologically and neurophysiologically, he then be more prepared to be nurturing. So, and what this society does is in the parenting advice, it doles out to young mothers and fathers, and in the stresses that it places the family under, it actually attenuates our parenting instincts
Yeah.
so that we parent contrary to instinct.
Exactly. And now being told also to let the babies cry themselves to
Oh, yeah.
sleep and this and,
When you
just,
let the baby cry, what you're actually doing is you're interfering with brain development. Because
yeah,
the baby's crying because she is desperate to be held. That's why they're
yeah,
crying. Because that's the
yeah,
only way they can connect.
yeah,
So they're just expressing their need.
yeah,
Well, that should enliven the parent's care system to hold the baby. But
yeah,
if the parent is following doctor's advice to let the baby cry it out,
yeah,
they're actually weakening their own nurturing system.
yeah,
And I've talked to a lot of mothers who followed that advice, and they say their heart is breaking while they're doing it.
yeah,
But that's what the doctor said,
yeah.
so they're going to do it. So they actually go with the intellect rather than the heart. Now, all this is,
I actually write exactly about that in my book, Ancient Futures. I talk
yeah,
exactly about that. The mother's sitting there dying to hold the baby, but she's been told not to. And then, of course, mothers of my mother's generation were told not to breastfeed even. I mean, it's just
yeah.
like, it's so inhuman.
But what the CNR has found in her research, you know what the average age of weaning was in a hunter-gatherer group?
About 3,
4 years. Yeah.
4, yeah. It
It,
was in Ladakh too.
it went from 2 to 5 years, but the average age was about 4 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
3, 4. No, and I've seen, I've lived in it, and I've seen, also seen a culture where suicide was virtually unknown.
Yeah.
Now we've got at least one a month, mainly young people, who are being pushed into conforming to these standards, doing well at these universities, distorting their brains, fighting to survive in a system where there are almost no jobs. So
Yeah.
another thing this economy is doing is systematically destroying jobs while polluting the atmosphere and turning that around to stop subsidizing energy and technology and instead to subsidize human care in all its forms, for the soil, for the care of children, how we build our houses,
Well, well,
you know.
if you actually look at human care, so during the COVID crisis, it was evident that some of the most vulnerable people were living in care homes
Yeah,
where they were looked after by really poorly paid
yeah,
and virtually non-trained caregivers.
yeah,
Now, if you also look at childcare, that's also amongst the most poorly paid. In other
yeah,
words, the most precious, so there's nothing more precious and important for society than the care of children, but it's so undervalued.
yeah,
And of course, anybody that doesn't contribute to the economy, it doesn't matter. So the elderly people, especially the poor elderly in these care homes, they have no value. They have no capital
yeah,
value.
yeah,
And since we don't consider life capital, what we consider
yeah,
just capital.
yeah,
So and this is also where you had the worst outbreaks. And
yeah.
in Canada, there was a study that showed that in the care homes, the ones that were privately owned, they had the worst conditions.
Really. Well, at
And
least that's worth something.
they're also the ones who gave out high dividends to their executives. So the more people died under your care, the more money you got.
Yeah,
Not that they were being paid for the
yeah,
deaths, but I'm just saying
yeah,
that the contradiction wasn't apparent.
yeah.
You
But
know?
to just step back and to look at how upside down this society is, I hope that people who are listening to us will feel that it's quite inspiring or hopefully positive to realize that there are economic causes of this madness. Because you said one of the most important things we do is to look after our children, should be. But also, what does it mean when we're treated like this as we get older? We all live in fear of aging. The monoculture also is imposing this image we're supposed to be forever young. We're supposed to be static. This entire anti-life system creates this neurosis and fear, which then, of course, feeds another whole industry in terms of plastic surgery and makeup and Botox, and all of that alienates and separates us further. It leaves us feeling lonely and empty, no real connection. None of us feel the love and the value and the appreciation that we all need and want. So hopefully people will feel from this conversation that it's helpful to know that this emanates from an economic system. It does not come from human nature. It's not human being. Don't believe that propaganda. Wake up instead to the need to change the economy.
Well, I in the chapter I'm just writing,
Yeah,
I talk about the series of disillusionments that I've been through. So
yeah,
I told you I was a good little commie in Hungary, and then
yeah,
Hungarian Revolution, all of a sudden I realized what a dictatorial, brutal system it was,
yeah,
which it was.
yeah,
And then I come to North America, and all of a sudden, of course, well, it's the Americans who are the heroes. They're the ones, Wall Street prosperity and
yeah,
freedom and all this. Then I see Vietnam, where they murder 3 million civilians, poison the land, defoliate the forest. People are still dying of cancer because of the Agent Orange, for which America is not paying a cent of reparations. So then there goes that illusion. Then for a while I believed that, well, gee, the Russians screwed up socialism, but the Chinese will get it right. So I started following the Cultural Revolution, ignoring the brutality that was being practiced against good human beings in the name of the Cultural Revolution, because I want to maintain this illusion.
yeah,
Then I become a good Zionist, right? And I think as a Jew who suffered, family suffered in the Holocaust. Now we're going to establish this free state, and the barbed wire of the concentration camp will be replaced by the boundaries of a proud, well-defended state. Then I have to get disillusioned about that, to find out that that's a very nice dream, but it happened at the expense of imposing a nightmare on the indigenous population by dispossessing, expelling, and killing them. So we think disillusionment. We think, it's disillusioning. And then I say to people, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned? Which would you rather be? Would you rather have illusions or disillusions? And Eric Fromm said that the people that make a difference in the world are the ones who are capable of tearing away the veil of illusion from the eyes of other people. And so,
yeah.
that's what you're saying. So that I hope that people will become disillusioned, because it's not a good thing to be illusioned. In other words, to believe what is not true and not to see what is true. So that if this conversation managed to disillusion anybody, I'd be really happy about that.
Yes, although I would like to put it in a slightly more positive way, and
Okay.
I would like to put it in the way of listening more to your heart and your experience, to hear, for instance, keep repeating what we said about grandmothers and how scientists had to prove that having a grandmother nearby is good for a grandchild.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that what we're talking about is actually not listening to, or it's not maintaining disillusion. It's waking up your body, your heart, and your experiential knowledge to listen to the truth that we need one another, that we
Yeah.
are caring, needing people, that we also have some models from indigenous traditional cultures. And what that has to do with is the humanity, is the human scale, the human interconnectedness, the fact that you depended on people whose name you knew, people you could speak to. You weren't dependent on an anonymous institution, either a giant government or giant corporations that you don't even know the names of. We depended on one another. And that is what localized structures can bring us. And it's doing that right now. I mean, we're actually seeing benefits on a small scale.
Do you
But
know
do
Wade?
you,
Do you
yeah,
know? Do you know Wade Davis at all?
I do. I a little
Okay.
bit, yes.
Yeah. So Wade studied Aboriginal peoples. He's an anthropologist, and he studied
Yeah, yeah,
Aboriginal all over the world, particularly in the South Pacific and also in Canada. And so this idea of wealth. So we think here that wealth is what we possess, but in other cultures, wealth is what you give away. The more you give away, the wealthier you are, because then you gain in human connection,
yeah,
and in
yeah.
gratitude and in community. So the one thing I do hope people get from this conversation is there's other ways of conceiving what humanity is all about. And now we've been um, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, propagandized is one word, but it's even more subtle than that. We've been
Yeah,
educated or imbued with
yes.
a certain view that doesn't actually match reality, and it's that gap between who we are fundamentally and who we're made to be in this globalized culture that creates so much illness and so much dysfunction and so much unhappiness and so much despair, actually.
And can you also say something about the examples of healing you're seeing? You know, how you could see that when there was the grandmother around, or how you saw among those drug addicts in Vancouver that caring for each other, how important it is. Have you seen examples that give you, that, make your heart sing and give you hope?
Well, I do, and I write about them. Amazing stories of healing that happen. Um, and it's usually, and I've documented this, but actually it's also been documented by other researchers that even in certain conditions that are considered to be terminal and Western medicine can't offer anything more, people actually come back and they heal. And this has been studied by a physician called Jeff Rediger from Harvard. I just wrote a book last year called Cured, an oncological psychologist called Kelly Turner in her book Radical Remission. And I've talked to both of these people, and what they say is that the fundamental healing agent, alchemic agent, is actually a transformation of one's inner identity from that socialized, isolated view that this society promulgates to somebody who's much more expansive and connected, and connected to the whole universe, actually. And that has a physiological impact sufficient in some cases to reverse fatal illnesses. And I'll tell you one more story. A colleague of mine, a physician, psychiatrist, I'm not a psychiatrist, he is. His name is Louis Mel Madrona, and he lives in the States, and he's of Lakota indigenous background in part. And he said in the Lakota tradition, when somebody gets ill, it's not seen as an individual isolated event, that the community actually gathers around him and they say to him, we realize that your illness represents some dysfunction, some rip in the fabric of our community. So thank you for taking that on. And we're here to help you heal so that we can all heal ourselves. So they see the healing not as which actually, healing arises from the root word for wholeness. And so they see the healing not as an individual biological event, but as a communal, biological, psychological, spiritual event, which is a very different way of looking at it. And it's far more scientifically accurate, actually.
Yeah, amazingly. Yeah, yeah. And particularly, of course, in our society where the toxic chemicals and the genetic modification, who knows the effect of the electromagnetic radiation. It is a collective system that we also need to change. It at some point it will be changed. I mean, we're gonna have we're gonna have more serious crises for sure, aren't we? I think that's inevitable.
But, you know,
But
but you know what? That's what Noam Chomsky once said, that he was asked if he was a optimist or a pessimist, and he said,
yeah,
"Oh, he said, strategically I'm an optimist, and tactically I'm a pessimist," which means that in the long term he sees the arc of history, barring climate disaster, by the way.
Yeah.
Obviously moving towards positive transformation, but in the short term, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that's really my understanding of it.
Yeah.
And I think the question for all of us concerned with it is not what results we can see in our lifetime, but how can we contribute to the process? So you, through your movement for localization, and particularly when it comes to food production and community, me through whatever I do, you know, whoever's listening, watching, through whatever they're able to contribute. But it's taking a long arc view of contributing to something that's larger than all of us.
Yeah. And not being attached to outcomes.
Yeah.
But I do want to make a plug as this final thing now for, thanking you for supporting World Localization Day, because we are seeing remarkable effects both in people and ecosystems.
Yeah.
When you support that principle of diversity, which is life. So the smaller scale farms, diversified, can provide for local markets. Farms have been forced to amalgamate and become bigger and bigger monocultures to survive in the dominant market, which our taxes subsidize, which our regulations support. But I'm so heartened by this upsurge everywhere you look, almost always led by women, by the way, but these smaller scale food systems that keep rising and keep coming back, even though they're stomped on by the dominant system, by our laws, regulations, and a completely fake economy where dead food from the other side of the world is cheaper than local, fresh, organic food. But despite that, the sort of building of those systems are so real and so healing for people and the planet. And so I'm really grateful to you for supporting that movement and for everything you've done. It seems that all your books and everything you stand for is in support of that life-based system and a rejection of the deadly monoculture which is killing us.
Well, it's about life capital, like John McMurtry says, you know, and what supports it is good, and what doesn't support it is not good. Now, look, first of all, everything I understand about human beings, everything I learned about human beings and human life and development would predict the success of these enterprises that you're talking about.
Yeah.
For all manner of social, psychological, physiological reasons, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised when you tell me this micro successes or these major successes on the micro level. You know?
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gabor. I hope we can talk again. I'm going to be very greedy and ask you again, I'm sure, because
it'd be a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
In every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development. We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no, to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities.